Our next session, again, is a parallel session. So the session in this room is the Geopolitical Churn, the Impact of Global Growth and India. And the parallel session is From India to the World, the GCC Revolution. So for those interested in the other one, you can move to Shah Jahan Hall. And for the Geopolitical Churn, we have it in the Darbar Hall, right here. So please remain seated. Some of you sitting at the back, can you move forward, please? Sitting back on the chairs, can you move forward, please? Nobody likes to have empty chairs in the front. It would be nice to have you all move forward. Thank you. Appreciate, much appreciate.
Hi. You know who's David is? I mean, recognize him?
Who?
David.
Yeah.
So because he has a presentation. So I have to hand over and to make him understand how to go next.
He'll understand, but...
Can you give it to me or should I put it in?
No, I'll give it to him.
That's just green for next, that's all.
Okay.
You just tell them green for next. First you are calling him only on...
May I request our speakers for this session, Geopolitical Churn, the Impact on Global Growth and India, to please come up on stage. May I have Professor David Bach, Mr. Michael Every, Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, Mr. Shiv Siddhant Kaul. May I also invite the moderator for the session, Ms. Indira Bagchi. Please join us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause and welcome them? Thank you so much. To begin this session, I'd like to invite Ms. Indira Bagchi, CEO, Ananta Center, India, to give her opening remarks and take the session forward. Over to you, Indira.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on the geopolitical churn. As we all know, geopolitics is cool again, and if you just cast a cursory eye over the world, at this point there are two active wars, one great power strategic competition, which may end up in a conflict, but it certainly will end up dividing the world in ways that we haven't even seen yet, and a new president. All very good ingredients for creating a churn of the kind that we may not have seen before. It's almost like a perfect storm. In a way, India is both part of this churn as well as being maybe in a position to exploit some of the opportunities caused by the crisis that we can see unfolding before us. I have a fantastic panel to discuss the issue, but let me begin by calling on Professor David Bach, the President of the International Institute of Management and Development in Switzerland, and the Nestle Professor of Strategy and Political Economy, to deliver his keynote address. Professor Bach.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure. It's an honor to be here with you. Thank you to the Ministry of Finance and to CII for inviting us. As you just learned, I lead a global business school based in Switzerland with a campus in Singapore, a research center in Shenzhen, an innovation hub in Cape Town. And I'm very excited to be here with you, share some thoughts on the current geopolitical landscape and the enormous opportunity it represents for India. I think I have a couple of slides. I don't know if they're ready to be pulled up. And then once I have those, we can get started. Let's see if I get the slides. There you go. Okay, so current geopolitics and the opportunity for India. You see, I'm a professor. I need slides. I need to stand. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to start in the most recent crisis, of course, the events of the last couple of days in Syria. And the reason why I wanted to start there is because it highlights what is fundamentally the current state of global affairs. And that is that this event has surprised many of the leading powers, and they have had remarkably little influence over events. The United States has 900 troops in Syria, had very little influence over what happened. Europe has been a bystander, making statements. We've had some influence from Turkey, but very limited. Israel has tried to contain the impact on its borders, but has not been able to shape events. The same has been true for Iran, in many ways a major setback for Iran. Russia, Assad's other ally, has been unable to prop up the regime, and both China and India have been missing and are not expected to play a major role in shaping the developments going further. And of course, the newly elected President of the United States, or the President-elect, has made very clear that the US has no business influencing the future of Syria. This is symptomatic of what Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia group calls a G0 world, a world in which no major power is willing or able to exercise global leadership. Of course, the big backdrop here is the fact that the world over the last several decades have moved from one of US hegemony to a much more significant rivalry between the US and China. If you just look at global GDP over the 60-year period, US GDP as a share of global GDP has declined somewhat, but the big story, of course, is the dramatic increase of China's GDP as China has become part of the global economy. And if you look at that in terms of a ratio, you see actually that over that 60-year period, the Chinese economy, or the US economy, has gone from being about 35 times larger than China's, and still 10 times larger than China's when China entered the WTO, to now being only about 1.3 times larger than China's. And the narrative that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is that this is a story of rise and decline. I was in China 6 weeks ago, and still very much people describe the moment that we're in as one of great power transition. This image that you see here trended on Chinese social media a few years ago, during the last Trump administration and the trade conflict at that time. And what you see at the bottom is a picture that shows negotiations between imperial European powers and Chinese negotiators, Chinese diplomats, after the Boxer Rebellion in the early parts of the 20th century. And if you look carefully, you see on the screen a delegation representing the European powers that is youthful, energetic, smartly dressed, and they're sitting across Chinese negotiators who seem like they're 250 years old. If you look at the upper picture, that's the negotiation in 2018 after the Trump tariffs, and you see a Chinese delegation that is youthful, energetic, smartly dressed, and American negotiators who look like they're 250 years old. And so the narrative was very much that at the beginning of the 20th century, China was old and the West was vibrant, and at the end, or the early 21st century, it's the opposite. The West is old and China is vibrant. Of course, the situation since then, particularly as a result of the pandemic and recent economic challenges in China, has changed quite a bit. As a share of global GDP, US GDP is actually increasing. The US has been the fastest growing global economy, and China's economic growth, or at least China's share of global output, has stalled to some extent. And if you look at just stock market returns, you see that investing in the US would have been much better for your portfolio value than investing in a set of Chinese assets. Much of that has to do with problems in the property market, as you know, and the implications for the financial system. But I think more broadly underpinning this is concern about an aging population and the impact that that will have on the Chinese economy. And of course, those of you who travel to China regularly know that there's real concern about the confluence of a property crisis, a financial crisis, and an aging population. And of course, the memory is very much there, omnipresent, of Japan's lost decade in the 1990s. In fact, as you may know, some are beginning to wonder whether China's global might has peaked. If you take a step back, I think there is reason to be quite skeptical. If we look at three material sources of global power, I would point to military power, I'd point to manufacturing, and I'd point to finance. And what you see is a picture in which the US remains dominant globally in terms of military expenditure. It's slowed down a little bit or fallen a little bit as a percentage of global expenditures, but the US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. If you look at manufacturing, China is the undisputed global hegemon in manufacturing, and of course that's where there is an opportunity for India as countries are looking for, and companies are looking for diversified sources of supply. But when it comes to finance, the dollar remains hegemonic, whether that is in asset markets or when it comes to trade. And of course, the Biden administration very effectively used US military and financial power to prop up the Ukrainian government. But you have this situation where when it comes to these three principal sources of material power, the US is leading two, China is leading one. But the world that we're in is very much one where the US, despite its dominance in military and finance, particularly under President-elect Trump, isn't likely to exercise global leadership. China is dominating manufacturing and has a strong position in trade, but President Xi doesn't want to exercise leadership either. I'm based in Europe, and I can tell you the Europeans would love to lead globally, but they don't dominate anything, and so that makes it particularly difficult. So that's the challenging world that we're in, and of course folks have been talking about this as the ingredients for a new Cold War, but I think there's reason to be quite skeptical about this, and that's because the US and China depend on one another in a way that the Soviet Union and the US never did. If you look at total trade between the Soviet Union and the US, when Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated an end of the Cold War, is about $5 billion. If you look at global trade between the US and China today, it is over 100 times that. So these two economies are very dependent on one another. And interestingly, much of the rest of the world, certainly the leading economies, are dependent on both of them. India is a very interesting example in that it is not nearly as exposed to China as many other economies are. But clearly, much of the world is exposed to both of these two economies. So when you have this increasing rivalry between these two global economic superpowers, I would argue that that creates opportunities for others, particularly other influential or powerful countries. And in this audience in particular, I suspect many of you say, well, wait a second, we've been there before. There have been opportunities before for countries, for non-aligned countries, when there is conflict between two superpowers. But of course, this is a very different era from that in the 1950s when the non-aligned movement came together. And that's because of the global connectivity that I talked about before. The world is much more interconnected. Goods, finance, ideas flow much more freely. And that creates a challenging situation, one in which being non-aligned means being very conscious about your interests and leveraging them. I found this article by India's former foreign minister particularly insightful, how she explains India's decision not to take sides in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine with a very rational assessment that doing so would not be in India's national interests. And indeed, she follows in that statement. I think Indian foreign policy more generally over the last several years follows very much in that realpolitik tradition that in the West at least is most associated with someone like Henry Kissinger. The Prime Minister certainly develops and maintains good relationships with the United States, but is equally comfortable with leaders of BRICS countries. And India has pulled off a remarkable feat, being one of the primary economic beneficiaries of Western sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, something that would ordinarily make it a pariah in the West, and yet the opposite has happened as the United States has rolled out the red carpet trying to woo India, and in this particular case, strengthen economic collaboration and investments. So India has been very skillful in taking advantage of the current geopolitical climate. Now, all of that was before this man's re-election and his return to power. And if there's one thing we know about Donald Trump, is that he's not driven by ideology. He's driven very much by an impulse to make deals. And I know in many national capitals, people are rereading his book, The Art of the Deal. And I think we can already anticipate a world over the next several years that is going to be shaped more by transactionalism, by deal making, and that has implications for both global politics and global business. So where does that leave India? I think plenty of opportunities for India. India is already benefiting from companies and countries trying to de-risk their exposure vis-a-vis China. I know some are already predicting an Indian semiconductor industry that can reduce the world's dependence on Taiwan. But certainly there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of enthusiasm about the opportunities that India represents at this particular critical moment. Now, I do have to close, or I'd like to close my remarks by just highlighting what some of our research at IMD says about the strengths of the Indian economy, but also some areas where development is going to be critical over the next several years. At IMD, we run a world competitiveness ranking, and we assess economies with over 250 variables in terms of their ability to create prosperity in the future. That's how we define competitiveness. And India currently ranks 39th in the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking. You see that many of the countries that rank at the very top there, including Singapore and Switzerland and Denmark, tend to be small, open economies. And India has made important progress in the World Competitiveness Ranking over the last several years. You see that right here. The general trend is positive and is up. But you can also see that there are two areas, economic performance and business performance, where India generally does better than when it comes to the role of policy, and in particular when it comes to infrastructure. So the story of India's recent success, certainly based on our indicators, is one where the private sector has been absolutely critical in driving economic performance. If you look at what business leaders appreciate about India, and this is an important part of our work, we do surveys among business leaders, both India and globally, about this, it is the fact that this is a country with a highly skilled workforce, a very dynamic economy, of course at attractive costs, and more generally the education level. Those are some of the things that stand out. But on the business side, there are also some really important opportunities, and I call your attention to the fact that when it comes to productivity and efficiency, India only ranks 43rd compared to, for example, the strength of the financial system. And when it comes to management practices, it is only 41st. So I wouldn't be leading a business school if I didn't say there are lots of opportunities here to work together, to strengthen talent, and to ensure that Indian enterprises have access to the best in management thinking and in management approaches to drive productivity. So if I were to summarize this and conclude, and I look forward to the discussion with my co-panelists, I think the opportunity for India at this moment is extraordinary. Your development, the incredible momentum here coincides with a geopolitical situation that is certainly complex and challenging, but affords extraordinary opportunities to India because of its status, because of its size, because of its momentum. At the same time, we have to be conscious that we are in a world that remains globalized, but without a whole lot of global leadership. And that means that pragmatism and interest-driven decision-making is going to be very important, I think, both in politics and in business. The Indian economy underpins India's global influence, and so the stronger and the more vibrant the economy is, and we've already heard this morning, the bigger India's clout is going to be. And of course that is a story about continued investments in infrastructure and supportive policies, but it is also about the continuous development of talent in Indian businesses, in the Indian private sector, to make sure that India gets to write an exciting, a prosperous and inclusive chapter in the next story of its history. With that, let me thank you very much, and I look forward to comments and responses from my co-panelists.
Thank you, Professor Bach. We will now open this up for discussion in the panel. And my first speaker would be Michael Every from Global Strategist from Rabobank in Singapore.
Thank you very much. I agree with nearly all of that, so I don't know how far the debate is going to go. What I would like to add, though, is just a little context, which is just how radical and potentially how rapid some of the changes that we could see within the context just described are. Because I think while we all agree that Donald Trump is transactional, from the runes that I read, Trump 2.0 will be very different from Trump 1.0. When he won office, didn't know who to put in the White House and the administration around him, and while he had a mercantilist businessman's instinct, didn't have any ideology or how things actually worked. Now, if you look at the cadre of people that he's put around him, they have one very clear ideology, which is make America great again, or America first, which, while it's vague and vacuous and contradictory to a degree, does have a lot of core, strong, common points, which have a lot of potential impact. And what I think we need to look at are changes not just in geopolitics, but in geoeconomics and geofinance, because since the end of the Cold War, which I'm old enough to actually remember happening, we've seen the emergence of one world central bank, which is effectively the Federal Reserve, one basically global borrowing cost. Dollars flow all around the world and everyone lends them on, so we all think in dollars when we're pricing internationally. Global trade, yes, is very integrated, we know that, but that's because dollar hegemony is based on the fact that the US runs the world's largest trade deficit with everybody, which benefits others exporting to it. That's your growth accelerator. Just sell to someone who sells to someone who sells to America. And America, of course, sends you dollars for that. That is one key point that everyone in the administration wants to end, one way or another. Now, can you end it overnight? No, absolutely. Can you end it without pain? That's a very big question. But they want to try and reindustrialize onshore or friendshore as much as possible because they see the current global paradigm as completely unsustainable. If it continues the way it is, America's vast military might will crumble away. Much of it was built at the end of the Cold War. The fleet is rusting. The cost of replacing a lot of it is just absolutely extortionate. They can't meet the goal of sending spare submarines to Australia, an ally that they've already pledged to them. They're in real trouble. So they need desperate reform for that. And part of it very much is going to run through trade. Now, if that happens, obviously everyone loses export opportunities to the US. There will be fewer dollars flowing internationally. You will see volatility and chaos in markets like you cannot believe, even if they begin to move towards it. But what I believe the Americans will do during that moment is not sit there blithely and blindly. They will be fully cognizant that that is what is happening. And they will, as we just heard, be looking at potential partners around the world and saying, look, we're still the biggest dog in the pack for now. We've got various tricks up our sleeve, from crypto and a potential crypto dollar, which maybe we'll discuss more in a moment. We've just had a breakthrough in quantum computing. We're the only ones with a functioning AI, which is really working. We may be on the cusp of developing AGI, artificial general intelligence, like in a science fiction movie. And we are prepared to roll our sleeves up and play dirty to get what we want. So here's a whole pack of tricks, or box of tricks, that we can play against you. And on the other hand, here's a box of candy. You can still have access to our markets. We can stabilize your currency with dollar swap lines whenever we want to make sure that you're completely macro stable. But the quid pro quo is, yes, you can run a trade surplus with us the way that you used to, but we want 100% alignment on this, this, and this. It won't be with everything. You'll have, free space to do some other things, and I think there will be give and take if America has any geostrategic intelligence. But it will very, very much, whose side are you on? Look at all the candy. Look at this nasty box of tricks. And I don't know how quickly we will come to that point, and I don't know how concretely we will come to that point. But the key point is, if they don't do that, if it purely is ad hoc, transactional, just playing around at the margin, a little bit on trade here, a little bit on trade there, which, let's be clear, the financial markets and the business community would love, because it's noise but not signal. Were they to do that, American hegemony is very much in trouble. You cannot be the primary military power without being the primary industrial power. You have to rebuild that with allies, or solo. But if not, gradually that military hegemony will fade. And if it does, the global system will be in even more trouble than it is now. And the next iteration of this presentation will be even gloomier than one we've just seen, because there will be more countries than Syria in those headlines. So it's a dramatic way to finish, but I've only got 4.5 or 5 minutes to try and get it across to you. The scale of what we're about to see is far larger than most people can conceive, potentially. The speed at which it could happen is, again, something that we should be aware of after seeing Syria effectively disappear from the map in just 12 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ivory. And I think that was actually a very important point about you cannot expect to be a military power without being an industrial power. It is something that I think we are thinking about that as well, and I think there is a lot of work happening in this country. May I now turn to Ambassador Arun Singh, former ambassador to the US, Israel, and France, to take this particular discussion forward.
Thanks, Indrani. I think based on what Professor Bach and Michael have said, just a few points. One, of course, it's said that businesses are happy when it's broadly an atmosphere of predictability and certainty. But when there is unpredictability, uncertainty, then more money can be made if you make the right calls. And I think we are going through that phase of unpredictability and uncertainty, and we have to be prepared for it. Also, it's been pointed out that we are in a phase of intense global contestation, even though there may not be a Cold War. And even if there's no Cold War, even if the US and Chinese economy are heavily interlinked, there's a clear message that US wants to maintain its preeminence and the technological lead. And so the US has declared that it's, although they are facing a challenge at the moment in Europe, their main economic, technological, and military challenge is China, which is the only country in the international system, both with the intent and capability to try and replace the role that the US is playing. And the US is now making a determined effort to push back on that. Now, the other element of uncertainty that comes in is that with President Trump coming in, he will probably make an attempt to bring to an end the active phase of the conflict in Europe. And if he's able to do that, certainly from India's point of view, that's a positive development, because then the India-Russia relationship would not come under the same adversarial gaze. Some of the sanctions on Russia would be removed. But then, will he be able to do that remains a question mark. Because in his first term, he tried to improve relations with Russia, but the US Congress blocked him by bringing in the Countering American Adversary Through Sanctions Act, where any major purchases that could be done from Russia would come under sanctions, because the US Congress sees itself as a co-equal branch of government. So President Trump has 2 years when both the Senate and House are going to be Republican, but what happens after that? So it's again something to watch. Also, if he moves positively with Russia, and if the European countries feel abandoned in this process, because from their perspective, they see whatever has happened in Europe as a direct security challenge to them. So if they see themselves abandoned in this process, then the transatlantic alliance would be weakened somewhat. And they would not go along with the US in terms of the strategy that the US defines towards China. Because the US needs European countries to buy in on the sanctions that the US is placing on China, like they needed Netherlands for the semiconductor sanctions. So the Europeans don't join the US on that, then the US strategy towards China will be weakened. So there is a lot of uncertainty playing out there. And if you look at the team around Trump that he has nominated, the national security team are hawkish on China. But the economic team that he has selected, the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, somebody like Elon Musk with tremendous power around him, have huge investments in China, billions of dollars worth of investments in profits. And the expectation is that they would moderate his attempt to bring in heavy tariffs on China. So although initially he spoke of 60% of tariffs on China, the first threats he's done is 25% on Canada, 25% on Mexico, and 10% on China. So how this battle between the two factions, the national security faction and the economic faction, will play out is something, again, we have to watch, bringing in an element of uncertainty. Because even in his first term, while he was hawkish on China, as his national security advisor, John Bolton, has written, in a meeting with President Xi, he said to him that if you buy more farm produce from the Midwest states, I will moderate my stance on China. So there will be a transactional approach. So I think from India's point of view, clearly, while the language has moved away from globalization of trade and production to secure supply chains, friend-shoring of production, onshoring of production, we have to see what is the opportunity in that for us. And as the US does more onshoring in the US, they will also need to buy elsewhere. But I think the other big opportunity for us is the technology partnership. Because in the US, they have absorbed that if they want to maintain the preeminent position, if they want to beat back on the Chinese competition, they need a partnership with a country like India with 1.4 billion people, which brings tremendous human skilled capital to the table. One of the major semiconductor companies, for example, recently said that they employ 17,000 people in India doing cutting-edge R&D and technology development work in one of their global capability centers. And the latest semiconductor design came out of India. 20% of the global talent for semiconductor design is in India. So the US also needs that partnership with India. And that's one of the reasons, for example, in January 2023, both countries launched this initiative on critical and emerging technologies. And following from that, there's cooperation in defense technologies. There's been cooperation in semiconductors, space-related technologies. So I think in addition to supply chains, a technology-based partnership leading to production sharing and leading to sectoral trading arrangements was something that we should be looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. You talked about tariffs on Chinese entities, Chinese companies. I think that must be something that Indian companies must be watching out very closely for, given our levels of imports from China, and to see whether secondary tariffs are applicable on Indian companies, and that's something that would, economics would then be following geopolitics there. May I turn to Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, our former ambassador to Italy, Thailand, Oman and Poland, and to talk about how this particular geopolitical churn impacts all of us.
Well, thank you very much, Indrani. I think a lot of points have been covered about the international situation today and the uncertainties and the risks that are there around the world. We also have uncertainty in the United States and policies, what these policies would be going forward. But I would talk more in terms of India, and I think India to grow in future needs a situation around it and the outside world which allows it to freely grow, to export more, to manufacture much more here in India, and at the same time employ its own people. So therefore, any uncertainty around the world, and that's the basic point here, creates situations where this would be retarded or would affect the smooth progress that the Indian economy wants to make. So if you take the Middle East, for example, and the disruption in oil supplies, for instance, or natural gas, if you look at the displacement that can be caused to Indian populations around the world, especially in the Gulf and the West Asia regions, or even if you talk about the supply chains and the sea routes of communication, which can be affected by turmoil around the world, that is a major risk that India has. In our own vicinity, over the past few months and years, we've seen turmoil. So, of course, we had a peaceful, relatively peaceful neighborhood till we have a situation now in Bangladesh, which has caused a lot of Indian companies invested in Bangladesh to also think very seriously about what kind of relationship this will be going forward. And at the same time, you have a neighborhood where you have an aggressive China in the South China Sea, but also growing in presence in the Indian Ocean, especially in the southern Indian Ocean and around India. So that creates its own dynamics. If anything happens in Taiwan, for instance, then that does also cause disruptions in supply chains as far as India is concerned, and its own options of trading freely with countries which are beyond the South China Sea, and also the other aspects of India's foreign economic engagement. So this creates its own uncertainties. But what is the situation in which India can cope with? Well, I think there are new opportunities, as was mentioned earlier, which have arisen as a result of the US-China rivalry. And we've been there before, as was mentioned by Professor Bach. But this time around, one cannot afford to miss that bus. So you have to be prepared in terms of practices in business which can actually take care of that opportunity. And fortunately, the government is quite well aware of that this time around. The businesses are quite well prepared for it. And hopefully that we will be able to take advantage of some of the sectors in which businesses will come India's way, and they should be capitalized on. Similarly, for manufacturing, the PLI scheme has worked fairly well. It's a mixed bag, of course, but I think we've got to make it work better and make more use of the opportunities that the PLI scheme provides. Also, in terms of business practices, I think supply chain resilience is very important. So Indian companies should also go out and look at Southeast Asia in the immediate vicinity, for instance, for investments and for resources. We've got to look at Africa, which has been a market which has been ignored in the past. And of course, our traditional partners in the United States and Europe, and that trade needs to be strengthened. India is currently engaged in a number of new foreign trade agreements and negotiations, and these should be pursued quite seriously as far as possible. But also in terms of sustainability at home, in terms of new business practices which will then overcome what is coming around the world. For instance, the CBAM in Europe, and also the Inflation Act in the United States, and also the fact that most countries are taking some protectionist measures. So all that needs to be taken into account when businesses try to plan what they're going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Wadhwa. I'd like to turn to Shiv Siddharth Kaul, our last speaker on the panel today. You can look at the geopolitics from the point of view of a significant economic actor, and how that in your view impacts economy or growth in this country.
So I think personally the turmoil is a great opportunity for where India is right now. If you start with where we started, and it's been a running theme, populism is emerging everywhere, this trend of retaking back your manufacturing base. That's okay for India because where our strength, our comparative advantage lies is in services. And this nearshoring language that we're hearing is primarily in manufacturing. So as long as we keep doing our services well and we keep executing and we keep finding ways to maintain leadership, I think we will continue to do well. Our service sector exports are now 6% of global service sector exports. We're all very happy about that. By the way, that figure is the same as China. So we're at par with China in that. Whereas if you look at merchandise exports, China is 30% and India is 3% of the global export chain. So, services we need to really accelerate and try and get. So I like to think of service sector exports. If China is at 30% in manufacturing, can we get to that level in service sector exports? And I think the language of tariffs is a little more difficult to apply to that sector. Where we are vulnerable perhaps is in things like data localization, data protection. So that is the space where our diplomacy needs to operate to ensure that we have enough of diplomatic cover, diplomatic protection from that onslaught. The other thing that I personally don't think conflicts are likely to reduce. And So where we need Atmanirbhar is in manufacturing, because we need to ensure that our own manufacturing supply chain, whether it's for defense or whether it's for our own production, is resilient. Our own supply chains need to be secure. If we can participate in global supply chains, that's a big bonus. But I think we need to act to ensure that we can manufacture competitively for our own massive demand. And I think that's happening. I think the language of make in India, as long as we can make competitively for our own citizens, our own security will be all right. The other big threat is in rising debt levels, and this is not just an India problem. India is probably better off, but globally, government debt is exceedingly growing fast, and what that means is there is going to be an inflation trend, perhaps globally. And that inflation could easily reach our shores. So how do we prevent that from happening? Are we doing that well? Are we not doing that well? And are we making sure that our own house is in tip-top shape before we kind of think of the globe in those areas?
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaul. I'm going to now open up to questions and comments from the audience. I have time for just a few. Janmay, and then first Janmay, and then the gentleman next to you. I'm sure there is a mic that should come around to you.
I have a speculative question, primarily for you, Professor Bach, because you're in Europe. At what point will Europe pivot away from the US to China? So here is what I want to build up on. One, the Ukraine will continue to be a crisis. The refugees will continue to be in Europe. And the fear of Russia will only increase if Trump and Putin, get onto good terms. Just now, German auto, Italian engineering, French luxury are suffering because the Chinese market is going away. And now Xi is being a less muscular in his foreign policy. If the US is very, very tough with China, and is tough with Europe, Europe can improve its defense budgets because it needs to for itself. But at what point will it pivot away from the US towards China?
Thank you. The gentleman next. I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time before I give it an opportunity.
This is a question, I mean, any of the panelists are competent, but
Sure.
Professor Bach, maybe you could take this. You mentioned three pillars on which global dominance is established. I'd venture to suggest one and seek your thing, which is critical resources. It was fossil fuels in the earlier days and will continue to be for some more time. Now I'm talking about critical materials. Not so much the origin, but the ability to process. That's what China controls, right? So that is also one more vector. And how can countries like India respond to that? And added to that was a comment that Mr. Kaul made. He spoke about very high levels of debt. Is there an opportunity for a country like India in such a scenario? Your comments, please, any of you.
Yeah, I'll take one more if there is any before I turn to the panel. Is there another question or a comment? Great. I think we're. If I could, since we will be running out of time very soon, I'm going to make this an answer and closing remarks. So if I can go the other way, if that's okay with everybody. So there was a question that came to you. Would you like to take that, and would you like to respond to anything that any of the other panelists have said?
I think the question was on debt, and is there an opportunity for India? So I think absolutely, but India is also suffering from a lot of off-balance sheet debt. So India is also in a precarious state, especially if you factor in local government and state government debts into our overall picture. So I think we are in a good shape because we are growing. And the opportunity is to ensure that we continue to grow without increasing the percentage of debt-fueled growth. And that is both from a private balance sheet perspective as well as a public balance sheet perspective, whether it's at the union government or the state governments or indeed at local governments level. So that's essentially my response to that. We are growing at 7%, and if we can continue that without fueling it by debt, we'll be in a very good shape.
Thank you. Mr. Ivory, would you like to?
On the same point?
Yeah, well, if you could respond to the points that were raised, and maybe if you had anything that you would like to respond to from the other panelists.
Sure, well, very quickly to the points raised. In terms of debt, when the next crisis hits, every country will be printing money. That's a given. The lower your debt is when you start doing that, obviously it's healthy, but the ship SS Prudence is going to sink. And the only issue is, can you end up clinging to the person who has the largest piece of driftwood on the sea afterwards, which again will be the US dollar. So you'll still want to be closer to them, even in that negative scenario where everyone's printing money. In terms of resources, yes, and critical resource processing, that's also important. The US has every resource under the sun, but they just process them in China because it's cheaper and all the pollution is over there. They can bring that all home in 5 minutes. And in fact, just overnight, we've seen Donald Trump tweet, because policy comes by tweet now, that anyone investing more than $1 billion in the US will immediately have all environmental regulations ripped up and all permits given immediately. So I think we can see what's going to be happening there. I'll leave it on that front, but I think that absolutely underlines the point I'm making about, the gloves are off now in America. This is a different ball game.
Thank you. Ambassador Singh, would you like to take a question?
Yeah. Thanks, Indrani. So on Janmijay's point, not to preempt what Professor Bach might say, so I don't think the Europeans will pivot towards China as such, because for a long time the Europeans didn't see China as a strategic threat. They saw China just as a trading opportunity. It was only under American pressure, and when the US started focusing more on the Indo-Pacific, that the Europeans realized that to keep US engaged in Europe, you must show interest in the Indo-Pacific. And that they started talking of the China's strategic challenge. So Europe came out with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany, Netherlands, UK, France, they all came out with Indo-Pacific strategies. And now because China is seen as strengthening Russia's defense industrial base, and also because China has reached Europe through ports and through the Arctic, that they see China as a strategic challenge. So what will happen is if they feel abandoned by the US in the context of the European security architecture, they will not go along with the US assessment of China on the strategic threat. But given the fact that they see themselves as democracies, their way of life, etc., they are not going to line up with China against the US. That would be my assessment. Now, in terms of the question on critical minerals, clearly there is a recognition of the challenge, and India has also joined the Mineral Security Partnership. And if you see the membership of the Mineral Security Partnership, it's US and Canada, 8 countries of Europe, ROK, Australia, New Zealand, and now India has joined. So that's not the usual kind of grouping that India joins, but the very fact that we are going there shows some of the strategic alignments or realignments that we see maybe in our interest. And just 2 other points, Indrani. One, the other thing we have to prepare for is this time the Chinese have prepared themselves to impose counter-sanctions. They have sanctioned Micron, they have sanctioned NVIDIA, they have done export controls on 3 critical minerals. So that will be another dimension that will play out. Earlier they had sanctioned South Korea, Japan, Australia, Lithuania at different times. So that's one dimension. And the final thing that has happened is that we saw the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater as 2 distinct theaters, including in geopolitical contestation. Today, the European, the West Asian, and the Indo-Pacific theater have become one theater. You have North Korean soldiers fighting in Russia against Ukraine. You see, because of what's happened in Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia not being able to sustain the Syrian leadership, and that has collapsed. And clearly also there is a link between China and Russia, and therefore a certain focus on the Indo-Pacific theater as an outgrowth of whatever is happening in Europe. So all these theaters, the contestations are combined. So there is a major global contestation going on, and there will be consequences, as we discussed, which we have to prepare ourselves for. Thank you.
Thank you. Anil, while when you are responding to the others as well, would you like to also touch upon the fact that in the geopolitical churn that we are witnessing around the world, there is a significant churn because of a geopolitical contestation between India and China as well, which has its own.
Yes, so certainly there is, a big effect that the China's rise has had on Asia, and particularly as far as India is concerned. I did mention in passing that the Chinese rise has meant more of a presence in around India, especially in the Indian Ocean and the southern Indian Ocean in particular. The rise of Chinese presence in countries around India, but we will see more of it going forward. And that's because there is a build-up which is happening as far as the Chinese Navy is concerned, also its nuclear forces, its missile defense, etc., etc. At some point in time, the Chinese will have to find an outlet for this in other parts of the world. And the closest proximity is, of course, the Indian region. We can also expect an increased Chinese presence in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular, where there are already economic investments, and to protect those and also to make sure that their sea lanes of communication have alternate routes, the Chinese naval presence will grow. That's a given fact. We also have a situation on our border, which, as you know very well, recently there's been a disengagement process which has been started. It's not a situation which has gone back to 1920, which happened before Galwan, but we are in the process of trying to restore that status quo, which India hopes for, and the Chinese would hope that would not come to that pass and would try to look over it. But I think the constant endeavor would be to go back to that situation. And meanwhile, if you see the economic situation which exists between India and China, there's a huge trade deficit, as we all know. In some cases, it's not bad that there is, there is an investment into India from even a country like China, which is needed. So I think the current effort is to see whether there is some amount of kind of guardrails which are imposed. There is also a certain amount of caution for certain sectors, which will happen going forward. But I think that dependency is not going to go away very quickly. On the point about critical minerals, I think you're absolutely right, because there was a time when the Chinese went in very strategically for acquisition of critical minerals, but also invested in processing facilities back home. And if you look at lithium, for example, it's a very polluting industry to process it. So obviously countries do not want to do that if they can help it. And that's exactly what happened in countries like Australia, which are naturally endowed with lithium. But at the same time, there's a realization now that there should be some diversification. So there are more countries which are coming into play by way of processing. India is one of those countries that has the capability of doing so and will do so in the future. And the same goes for, if you look at chips and, in computer software, hardware, both. Because anything to do with future technologies is something which needs to be developed and adapted in India as well.
Thank you. Professor Bach, I think the questions were addressed to you.
Yeah, but they've been answered so effectively by my co-panelists. So on the question of Europe pivoting away from the US into its China, I completely agree with Ambassador Singh. If you look at the history of the transatlantic relationship after World War II, you see at various moments efforts by Europe, usually led by the French, I should say, to carve out a distinctive position internationally. And quite interestingly, it was President Macron of France just last year who said Europe should not get dragged into the conflict, the rivalry between the US and China. But of course, as long as Europe remains dependent on the United States for security, there's only so far that Europe can go. One of my colleagues recently remarked, I thought quite cleverly, that when it comes to Germany, Germany outsourced its security to America, it outsourced its energy to Russia, and it's outsourced its growth to China. And to some extent, that represents how Europe has been operating. Now, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe has fairly quickly weaned itself off of Russian energy at considerable economic cost, I should say. I think it's more likely to wean itself on dependence on growth from China than on American security. So everything you say would depend on an independent European defense capability, and I just don't think that that's on the horizon. And even if it were, you still have the ideological links between the US and Europe, despite all of their differences that would stand in the way. I will say, however, that what I'm quite excited about is opportunities for Europe and India to intensify their collaboration, not just economically, but politically, because one thing is to be broadly allied with the United States, but another one is to pursue within that context strategic interests. And I think India and Europe have a whole lot of interests in common, again, economically and politically. I'll make just one last quick point on critical resources. I said before, my premise was that this current geopolitical context provides opportunities for countries to benefit from the rivalry between the US and China. And we talked about India, of course. We haven't talked about Africa. And Africa has been very much a subject of overtures, of course, first from China and more recently from the United States. And Africa is resource rich and rich in minerals. And I think there is a desire to make sure that the exploitation or the production, I should say, of resources this time around goes hand in hand with investments in processing and in manufacturing. I think there are a number of African leaders who are quite keen on making sure that African resources can lead to job formation and broad-based economic growth. And so again, there the question is going to be, what role are the various economic powerhouses going to play in helping Africa leverage its immense resource wealth into broad-based prosperity? So another place where I would look for additional sources of power and influence, as you rightly put it.
Thank you, Professor Bach. We are completely out of time, of course, but thank you very much to the panel for a great discussion, and as well as to the audience, and very good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Bagchi. May I request you to kindly hand over a token of appreciation to all our panelists, please. And I will request Mr. Siddhant Kaul to kindly hand over a token from our side to Ms. Bagchi for moderating the session beautifully. May I request all the panelists to step forward for a photo op, please? Our next session, ladies and gentlemen, will be here in this hall, and we will start. The session is on emerging out of the post-COVID world, monetary policy and fiscal policy actions. This session will happen here in this hall. And we will start as soon as we've turned the table around. I request all of you for your patience and to remain seated.